Hello creeps! Andy here, and today I have to talk to you about one of the best books I've ever read, Irvine Welsh's Skagboys. I have a lot to say about this, and my notes are probably all over the place, and I'm sorry, this is just how my brain works. But I'm just going to do kind of a deep dive into this book. But don't worry, there's nothing here that I'll say that will give the book away. It's quite long. It's over 500 pages. So even if I told you every single thing I remembered about the book, I wouldn't be giving anything away. Also, this book is really just following this group of friends into their addiction. Although it's plot driven, it's more just following these kids and seeing the highs and lows of life. You know, you get to see them have their first jobs and move into their first apartments, their relationships with their families, their trials and tribulations. So it's not really like there's anything that I can say that would give that away. Do not worry about me ruining anything. You will still enjoy this. But before you run out and grab this book, I would like to give you a few warnings. I just want to make sure that whoever picks this book up knows what they're getting into when reading it, because I didn't. And luckily I ended up loving it, but I could definitely see why some people might find it a little bit challenging. And don't get me wrong, I did find it challenging at the beginning. And honestly, the way that it's written is an experience in itself and allows for even more of an engaging read, in my opinion. So yeah, these are just my thoughts and ideas on this. But first, let's just jump into the story. So we do have a group of friends. They are in their early 20s, late teens, early 20s. It's over a certain amount of time. And we have Mark Renton, who happens to be our main character, but we do have alternating perspectives. So it's not just told from Mark Renton's perspective. Can you chill, book? We have Allison as well. She's in here a little bit here and there, but she's really not in it as much, ouch, as some of the other boys are. We have Sick Boy, Spud, Begbie, we also have Franco, and there's other characters as well. I mean, you'll probably come across 20 or 30 characters in the span of this book. You also get to meet some of their parents and siblings and all sorts of stuff. There are also no quotations in this book, so you don't have direct quotes. Instead, you just have a line and then whatever the person's saying. So although that doesn't make a huge difference in the book, it's not like it's difficult to figure out. You do have these large blocks of text throughout the book, whereas sometimes dialogue can break that text up. This book is not like that. As far as what the book is, I mean, if you can't tell by the title, it is this group of friends' descent into their heroin addiction. YouTube can be kind of weird with specific words, so I'm just going to use the term addiction from here on out. But it really is just how they got into it in the first place, how it ended up taking over their lives, and how they changed as people taking this drug. And it's also more than that too. But before we get into everything, let me just give you a quick warning on how the book is written, because it's written in such an interesting way. So it's written, how do I explain this? Phonetically, how Scottish people speak. Does that make any sense? So I'm gonna pop up a quote right here. This is gonna not make any sense out of context, but this is just a quote that I have highlighted. So I'm gonna pop it up and you can look at what it looks like, and then I'll tell you what it's saying. Listen, if you go out without a fucking jacket when there's fucking snow flying about, you can get a fucking cold, right? And then the girl replies, what the fuck are you talking about? Jacket, snow. So do you see what I mean there? It's written phonetically like a Scottish accent. And I would say that that's probably 70% of the text, maybe up to 80, 85% of the text is written phonetically like that. Now, I'm not gonna lie, when my American brain began reading this, it took a lot of brain power for me to try to figure out what was going on. And especially words like always are written weird. And so there were plenty of times where I had to stop and be like, what is this saying? So for the first 20, 30 pages, my brain was like, what is going on? But the weird and kind of interesting thing about it is that eventually your brain just catches on, and then it kind of fills in the blanks for you. So eventually I didn't have to stop at every sentence and try to figure out what was going on. Eventually my brain just got in the habit of reading like it. It was such a unique experience. I've never read a book like that before. So yeah, truly a unique experience just reading a book that was written like that. But I wanted to give that forewarning just in case you think that that might be difficult, or, you know, that might turn you off of the book. So I just wanted to let you know. Otherwise, let's get kind of back into the synopsis. I'm going to be reading you some favorite lines. I'm going to talk about why I personally connected with this story, because it may not be why everybody connects with it, you know? And then go into maybe why things are the way they are. And then we can wrap up the end about what I actually think the story is about. Okay. So first of all, I need to say that this book is hilarious. I have never laughed so hard in my life reading a book. In fact, I wrote right here, no book has made me laugh harder. Fuck, I don't want this to end. That is truly how I felt. And the book is long. It's over 500 pages. And I know sometimes when you're reading a long book, or at least when I'm reading a long book, I can be like, oh, man, okay, cut to the chase or whatever. I did not feel that at all in this book. I was engaged, and I don't know if it's because the way it was written, it kind of forces your brain to work a little harder to figure out what's going on, or not figure out what's going on, but like my brain had to overwork to read the sentences. I don't know if it was that, or if it truly was just that engaging of a story, but there is not one page in here that I was bored. I can promise you that. What I will say is I didn't know the meaning of why every paragraph was in here, and every perspective of a particular character. There were definitely some things where I was like, oh, I wonder why that was mentioned, or that little, you know, story was put in here. But this is, again, part of a series. There's 4 or 5 books in the Mark Renton series, so it could definitely come back later. But I was not bored at all reading this. So let me just give you kind of an example of the humor in the book. I'm not going to give you context for what's happening, but all I'll say is that they're in a group therapy session, and I'm not even going to go into who or what or anything, because it's not prevalent to this funny scene of the story, but I just thought it was so funny. Okay, so they're in this group therapy session, and one of the characters is making this thought in their head. He says he wore slip-on shoes. The is unaware this means that 80% of the room automatically thinks he's an irredeemable wanker. So he's just making fun of this therapist in his head, making fun of these slip-on shoes. And then you have, about 15 pages later, the group of people with this therapist are broken up into 2 groups, and they're supposed to write a list about why they started doing heroin in the first place. And so there are things on this list like society, politicians, humans, liars, all sorts of stuff, right? And you get to the bottom of this list and someone writes slip-on shoes. There were so many times where I just was cracking up, and I don't know much about Scotland. It's where the writer is from and where this book takes place. I don't know much about Scotland, but if Scottish people are half as funny as this book makes them out to be, I am moving there immediately, because this book was, it was hilarious. I have never laughed so hard. Now, that is not to say that this is a comedy in any way. It very much so does mirror life, where there are ups and downs. You have really super silly, weird things that boys do, you know, boys will be boys kind of thing. And then you also have these really traumatic, devastating, heartbreaking, horrendous things that happen in this book. I would say that this is not for the faint of heart. You know, I mean, it's not like an extreme horror book or anything, but sometimes these type of books bother me more than, say, an extreme horror book, because they're real life, actually could happen kind of things. It's almost like a Donald Ray Pollock, The Devil All the Time, although maybe not to the extent that that book is fucked up, but there really are a lot of major messed up things that happen in this story. Okay, so let's just kind of get back to the story. So we have these characters. I gave you a list of them. It really is about how the group is brought into addiction, how it changes them, and maybe they're not the best people before, or obviously it's dependent on characters, but maybe there are a character or two before the addiction sets in that you think are kind of scummy, you know? But my goodness, what these people do after their addiction sets in is mind-blowing. And we'll get to this also in a second, because you can't condone their actions. I mean, it is like life-ruining, horrendous things that these people do. And even when the characters aren't that awful, just even the lies, the manipulation, what they do to their families, it's just such a fucked up story. And it really is. It's a tale of addiction, and that's probably why I like it so much. I did have an addict staying with us on and off for like a year and a half. And I don't think that you need that experience to love this book, but I do think that that maybe shaped why I loved this book so much. So I just wanted to give that information to you because that's probably why I thought that this was one of the best books ever. And it's told from the addict's perspective. And again, we'll get to that in just a second, but it really did, I don't know, it was just a lot of like, oh yeah, yeah, the lies and the thievery and the manipulation and the bullshit. And it really does just turn people into monsters. And it's heartbreaking, you know, and might be the reason why I haven't slept in the past 2 weeks, but that's another story. But anyways, and it's something that just doesn't end, you know, it's like a lifetime of just dealing with this, and it's so hard. So anyways, so Mark Renton is really our main character, but like I said, it does have an alternating perspective, and we do get perspectives of a bunch of different characters. And the book actually does start quite optimistically, even given the socioeconomic issues that are taking place. So the book starts out with these workers who are being laid off, kind of screwed over by these big corporations, and they're not, the police aren't even allowing them to picket in front of these big corporations. And so even with all this stuff happening, and there's like police brutality and stuff that begins at the beginning of the book, you do have optimism from our main character. He says, and this world is a pretty fucking okay place. And that definitely changes throughout the story. Mark Renton has a disabled brother who passes away in the story. Allison's mom has cancer. She passes away in the story. I'm not like, these aren't major things. You're told from the get-go that these people will not be around for long. You also have people losing their jobs. I don't want to give too much away, but losing loved ones, getting their heart broken. I mean, there's a range of messed up things that happen in this story that you go along with. But you really do see the pain in the life of these characters, and even when they're quick to brush it off, you know that it's still harming them. So let me read you a few favorite quotes. I'm just going to skim through these here and read them to you. And out of context, hopefully they'll make sense, but they're just quotes that I really liked throughout the book. Almost all our sorrows spring out of our relationships with other people. And again, I'm reading these just in a normal way of reading them, even though they are written phonetically in a weird way. I always like to avoid other people's social conflict. I much prefer to start my own trouble. Escape to oblivion where they cannot get at me. Ooh, this one's gonna be hard. Okay, this is when Allison's mom passes away. It says she's rotting away from the inside, saying to her, I love you, Mom, over and over again, to the sack of skin, bone and tumor, wrapped in bandages across her chest the surgeons made flat, hoping and praying for a God I've never really thought about to suddenly enter those wounds. Oh God, this one kills me. It wasn't Mom anymore. She could barely recognize us on the drugs they were giving her. Now she's gone and nothing can hurt, but not to see her again ever. That's just way too much to get my head around. I'm 21 years old and I've just watched my mother die. Sorry. This page got to me and got me sobbing in the middle of the night because I was in my early 20s too when my mom passed away, and this was very reminiscent of how things went with me. So yeah, it's not to say that there definitely aren't dark moments in there. This book made me laugh, it made me cry, it made me outraged, it made me angry. It brought out all the emotions. So yeah, I guess I connected with this book in more than one way. But yeah, that page fucked me up a little bit. Okay, next. 375. That's 275, you moron. And this one says, when asked why he's taking the drugs, it says, we're just ordinary boys who have drugged themselves into nothingness to avoid the shame of doing nothing. So those were just some of my favorite lines in there. But through this story, through the telling of these characters' lives, we do get kind of a parallel almost historical feeling element to it, being that it's written as newspaper articles or what have you. I'm not saying that this actually happened. I have no idea. I have zero historical knowledge of what happened in Scotland, but basically we received this information about the economy and high unemployment rates. We also get more information on this pharmaceutical company within this town that manufactures drugs, how there's a breach in security, and that is how this particular drug gets put out on the market. And so you really kind of do have this perfect storm of giant layoffs, a lot of young children, because it does affect like those working class workers. A lot of these younger, you know, kids in their early 20s don't have jobs. They have a lot of time on their hands. A lot of them aren't going to college. This takes place, I believe, in the 80s. And then you have this drug that's entering the market. And so it really is just this perfect storm for addiction. And you also do get even more information about where this pharmaceutical company is looking into the breach, and how other brown enters the market from more Middle Eastern countries. It's really honestly an interesting thing from a historical perspective, even if it's historical fiction, even if it's just plain fiction, but just that other element added to the story was actually really interesting to read. I just wrote damn for this, so let's see what this is. He says, I loved that girl, I really did. There was a horrible spasm inside as I realized that even there and then that she'd soon become less important to me than a person he was buying drugs from, that he had just met and didn't even like that much. So you really do get to see the effects of how this drug really does take over their life. You get comments about how they used to do it recreationally and now they can't go 4 hours without it. You see them change physically, but particularly with other characters talking about how they look, you know, their face looks sunken in, they look thin, they look emaciated, their teeth are falling out. You do get a lot of comments like that. And you also get to see them withdraw more, how far and deep they go into their own lies, and how they justify what they do. You also do even get a comment saying something like, it's the worst thing in the world. I never want to see it again. I never want to do it again. I know it's disgusting, but the moment I get a chance, I'm going to run and do it. And it is just heartbreaking. You also even get a comment, a whole page actually, on what that first time was like, which was honestly interesting. They kind of just describe it as everything just goes quiet, and like the anxiety and the thoughts in your head, everything's just fine. I don't think I have to say this, but I absolutely hate drugs. Like, I've seen them destroy so many people's lives. I'm currently seeing them destroy people's lives, and it just, it sucks. I hate it so much. But it was really interesting hearing it from a perspective of these addicts versus like a movie like Trainspotting or Requiem for a Dream or The Salton Sea, where you're kind of an outside perspective looking in and the movies make you feel dirty. This was so different because you're through the eyes of these characters. And so even things like, oh, I took a hit and then I fell asleep. Like, I don't know if you've ever seen anybody on these drugs, but it just turns them into zombies. It is so heartbreaking. It's awful. But even just seeing them downplay that, or downplay how they feel, or downplay how sick they are, or downplay what they do to people, it's just such a wild, interesting ride. What they do to their family, how they really don't have any thought other than themselves, because that's just how it happens, you know? And how the next hit is all that matters. Yeah, isn't that the flippin' truth? Oh, this I thought was really interesting. This quote here, I thought, yeah. It says, I fucked over that many people that if I stay clean, the guilt and remorse will fucking kill me. It just isn't worth it. And then you have this comment that says, how many stones of regret would he need to carry in his gut over his life? You either have to learn to be better and cope with what you've done, or just learn to not care. Oh, that line got me. It's so messed up. It's so messed up. But I thought that this was such a great book, and I just connected with it in a lot of freaking ways. And you know what? Luckily I read it before all of this stuff was going on, because I was able to enjoy it. If I read it after, I don't know how. I think I would have been a lot more pissed about it. But anyways, and then I also have this comment here that I think describes the cover of the book, which I'd like to read to you. One of the characters, I'm assuming it's Mark Renton at this point, but he just says here that I felt like a skagged doll being shaken by a manic puppeteer. And I think that that's what kind of the symbolism of the front cover is, that, you know, you really are just a puppet to your addiction and you're not even really living life for you. But I thought I'd share that with you because I found that rather interesting. I also did want to talk a little bit, because I do love books where you kind of dig under the surface and try to find meaning or symbolism or metaphor or foreshadowing and all sorts of stuff. But with this one, I thought that it was really neat because although there are things like that in here, for example, you have Allison who works for an arborist for trees, and they're trying to save these specific types of trees because they've been run down with either bugs or fungi or whatever it is that's causing this illness in them, that they're dying, but they're also spreading this illness to other trees. So they're trying to stop the spread by finding the trees that are infected and lighting them on fire. And so at first you're like, okay, what is this about? And then you're like, oh, well, maybe it's about Allison's mom because she's dying from cancer, and it made sense to whatever it was. And then Allison goes on to compare these trees to her mother, and you're like, oh, okay. But then you also are like, well, this also could be foreshadowing to the AIDS epidemic, because that is something that is mentioned progressively as you go throughout the book, and how all of these things that I have said that were a perfect storm kind of did lead to this explosion of AIDS within this time, sharing needles and what have you with addicts. I mean, most of the people that are infected with AIDS in this story, not that they're the characters, but they do give you information on different people. Most of them are through secondhand needle use. So I do think that there is stuff to dig under the surface, but I think that the writer, he does a good job of also just telling you what it is, and you don't have to sit and think and be like, what did he mean by this? He really does just tell you. Another example of this is our character Mark Renton in college. He's discussing F. Scott Fitzgerald's book. I think it's The Great Gatsby, but it honestly could be a different book. And he has a conversation with a student teacher there, and they're like, you missed the whole point of this book. And he was like, I don't understand. And then we get way later in the book, I mean, hundreds of pages later, and he has this whole conversation with a therapist about this. And fuck, I didn't even write down the page. I can just give you a synopsis, but basically he's talking to his therapist and he's saying, oh my gosh, I just got what that F. Scott Fitzgerald thing was. He thought he was writing about the American dream or what have you with The Great Gatsby, but he was really writing about his wife's mental illness and his descent into alcoholism. And his therapist says, well, don't you think his wife's mental illness could have caused him to drink heavily? And then Mark Renton says, I know what you're trying to do. You're just trying to take out his wife's mental illness and put in my disabled brother's death. And basically it tells you right there exactly why this book was brought up, and it tells you a lot about the character, because although he says in a lot of ways that he doesn't care about his brother, you know that he does. And although having a disabled brother added a lot of complexity, especially to the relationship between his other brother and his parents, especially his mother, because his mother was always tending to his disabled brother. There's a lot of negative emotions towards his brother, but you know that there's a lot of love there. So regardless of what he says was the death of his brother and him trying to forget and him feeling guilty for the horrible things that he thought about his brother and other messed up stuff, you know, could that have been a factor in what led to his addiction? I'm sure it was. And that's kind of what you get to see throughout. They seem like normal kids, and you even have them say, people ask me why I did it. It was just there and I did it. It's just what it was. But you do see a lot of pain that these people are covering up. So what is this book actually about? It honestly is a really interesting way to explore male trauma, to explore pain, loss, sexuality, brutality, and how they use these things to cope with their feelings, to understand the world around them. This is a story from, I believe it's supposed to take place in the 80s, correct me if I'm wrong, but even now, I mean, our society, I think, is still dealing with that manly man, don't show your feelings kind of thing. And it is interesting to see them try to figure out how to deal with this trauma, loss, emotion, death, pain, and how even some of the characters resort to brutality to feel something. It's actually really fucked up. And so, although I can't say that you feel for these characters, I can't say that you condone their actions, and I don't think that you're sympathetic towards them, I think you can learn something by reading this and maybe understand at least a sliver of what's going on and what led to the addiction that they're in. Otherwise, wow, what a freaking interesting read. I mean, there's so much I loved about this book. Again, I do think that a lot of people, if you're interested in everything that I said, could absolutely enjoy this story. But I do think that my own personal life definitely played a role in how much I loved this book. But otherwise, this was one of the best books I've ever read. Truly 5 out of 5 stars. I couldn't recommend it enough to people who are interested in reading books about addiction and everything else that I just said. Anyways, thank you for letting me just rant about how much I loved this for however long that was. I appreciate it. Let me know your comments on Skagboys or Trainspotting or any of the other books in this series if you've read them, or any Irvine Welsh books if you've read other ones. Let me know what you think. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you soon with another horror video. Bye guys.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear that the thoughts build up until I can't hear, that my mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper.